I do want to start though with a quick little tutorial snippet thingy on centerline bunkers and just how to get the fairway around those, because this is a question I get quite frequently. Let's just say I'm going to take anything here. Let's just make some fairway in this area, put a bunker in the middle. This is going to be just a whatever bunker. Let's just even go full on circle for the emphasis. Okay, there's a bunker. It's beautiful, right? Let's sculpt this a little bit. Not much, just so we can see, okay, there's a bunker. It kind of sits a little with the fairway. Okay, whatever. It's not going to be any nicer than that for now. Oh, maybe. A little bit of a high side. Okay. Very basic bunker. It's functional and nothing but. Hey, Frisky Stick. Enjoy your time here. After this little bit, I'm going to open it up for... It's going to be much more open. You can just ask questions whenever the hell you want. So, we have our fairway on the outside. Let's just spline that in now. Very basic fairway. Ignore this bunker placement too. If you want the same kind of stuff but a little bit more in depth here, B101 did a quick tips episode on this. So the important thing now to do this is, in order to get the bunker in the center and get like a nice little bit of rough around it, if you just go and fill the spline, you get that little tiny strip, and sometimes, or a lot of the time, this kind of goes against the look that you want with your course. So you don't want to do that. The trick around it actually involves using 3 spline paths. Or the second option is to use, well actually instead of, you can use 3 spline paths, or you can use 2 and fill the middle with brushes. But this always starts the same way. So we're going to just close the first path. We don't want to fill it. And then we make a second spline path around the inner bunker, or inner one around the bunker. And then we do the same thing with this one. We want to close it, but don't fill. Let's just smooth as well, because why not? Okay. So now we have some rough around our bunker. And this is the important part of this trick. So, you can either fill this entire middle area with brushes, but I would generally recommend you use splines for this unless it's too narrow in between. The reason being that every once in a while with brushes you can accidentally miss part of it. So the way to do this here, you kind of take a third spline path and you start around the edges of this one so that it kind of fills the middle. But we never go all the way around the inside and then click fill, because the way the game is set up, surface-wise, it will think this middle area is fairway and fill it too. So what we have to do is kind of build a bridge here, go all the way around this bunker, pretty close back together, and go back out. And what this little bit here does, it makes the game think that the part inside is rough, because it technically is. And we know that in reality, these fairway bits are still close enough together that they will overlap, and it will look continuous when it's done. So now, what we need to do is just continue around the outside of this. And then this time, we fill the spline, and boom. We have our in fairway rough. This is how you do this. And obviously you can adjust the width in here ad nauseum. Say you want this part up a little higher, a little more rough here, to get it to sit a little more nicely. Move this spline point. Something like that. And it's a bunker. It's functional. That's how you do this thing. And I hope you guys enjoy using this in your course designs. It's very useful, and it gives you a much more polished look as well. Indeed, it's quite important for beginners. It helps so much. It takes something that gives people kind of almost a little bit of stress. So you're just like, oh, I'm not sure how to do this. And exactly what you said, Frisky. Lots of people who are new to this designer, it's not something that you will just instinctively figure out on your own most of the time. And I actually started myself with LiDAR courses, and in the first one I had a bunch of islands, like grass islands in the bunkers, and I just could not for the life of me figure out how to get the grass in there easily, to the point where myself being new and inexperienced and just even being the designer for the first time was enough for me. I was just like, okay, I don't think I can do this. So I published it, and the sand was just completely full. It covered the island, so there were little mounds inside the bunkers and stuff. And that was really fun. So basically, with this kind of stuff, it's the same thing. If you want islands of rough inside the bunker, it's the same trick. We end up taking the bunker itself with splines, although you can always do it with brushes and get islands. This was specifically for LiDAR stuff. And you kind of take the splines, go around, and then you want an island in here. Same exact kind of thing. I actually think I will include this as part of the clip, just because it's still helpful to some people, potentially. This is what you would do with splines if you wanted a bunker island. And then in terms of polishing it up really nicely, you can pull on some of the spline handles themselves and stuff, and sometimes even drag the spline points across a bit. That one that way, this one this way, and it should close with the middle part pretty nicely. Now there's worse stuff than seeing a bunker brush plopped in the fairway, but I know exactly what you mean. Sometimes it works well with the look you're going for, like Grovy's done a bunch of courses like that, and I think it's done in a way that I can't necessarily fault the courses for having that on them. So it all depends. That's a pretty important little thing there. So I wanted to go over that first. So now for the main stuff. I'm just going to catch up. Your first course was HB Autogen, and you spent hours and hours trying to make it look natural. Your first course was before Avalon, I guess? I'm assuming that was not your little first course. Avalon was your fourth, okay. So now I'm going to kick things off now for the actual part. Welcome back to part 7 of the visuals tutorial series. For this section, we're going to spend some time looking at how to use the sculpting tools, some tips and tricks with them, a couple techniques here and there, and also some aspects of bunker sculpting and applying a lot of the stuff we covered in parts, I would say probably 3, 4, 5, and 6 to what you do in the designer. There are a couple things I want to mention first. I do want to try to demonstrate stuff on both mouse and keyboard and controller for this section, and also mention how difficult some of these techniques might be on one versus the other, and workarounds on mouse versus controller and that kind of stuff. Some things will naturally be a little bit easier on one than the other. I'm also going to try to keep things pretty, or a little bit on the slower side, I should say. Because for a lot of people who are newer to this, it can be kind of hard watching someone just go, with the tools and then not understand what happened. So if at any point you guys have a question about something or want me to slow down and explain what I'm doing, feel free to do so. I want this to be much more open rather than, okay, I'm trying to present something here and just going on and do it and most of you guys are just listening. There's one quick thing, which is just a PC thing. Unfortunately, console guys, you don't really have access to this. Which is, if you want to remove the HUD, like the overlaying display, you just press F10, and then when you get this box, you can hit F11. There are a few flyover options, I believe, that I have not really explored. And in camera options, if you're trying to get camera settings, if you're trying to get some nice picture stuff, you can go wide here with the FOV, kind of like a little bit of a GoPro type of angle. If you want to take a picture like overhead of a course routing, and then you can go a lot narrower if you want to pick up more detail. Like if you start going, the default width in the designer is 35, so if you start getting into like the 15 to 20 range, it's basically like zoom, but it also shows you more detail at the same time, so you can see more of what's going on with the land and stuff, whether you're trying to just take nice pictures or maybe just get a more detailed view of what's going on with the terrain. That can be handy sometimes. But 35 is default. That's where I'm going to be keeping it. This. It does not snap back out in 2K21 if you pause and go to the menu and then step out of it. In TDC19, it would snap back to 35 no matter what when you're in the designer, and it did that. For playtesting, it's actually 45, so if you want to, you can try to get that same exact look without actually dipping into playtest if you're just checking visuals by adjusting the FOV that way. So I think the most important thing to kick off with here, let me see what you said first, actually. First not approved, then you got 2 approved that were not very good, and then Avalon. So the next thing here, I want to go over a couple quick differences just between what the brushes do and that kind of stuff. And I think this can also help people when it comes to one of the toughest things as a designer. And I still sometimes get this mixed up a little bit, or it's just not always clear. And this would be, when do you want to use flatten and when do you want to use raise? And there are not necessarily any hard set rules for any of this stuff, because there are lots of people who sculpt almost exclusively with raise and do a really, really, really good job. There are lots of people who sculpt almost exclusively with flatten and do a really, really, really good job. You can get either one to do what you want it to, as long as you generally understand how the tools work. I think the advantage of flatten in some cases is that it's a little bit easier to kind of control the smoothness of the terrain, although the brush itself functionally is a lot more complicated. So I'll probably spend a little bit more time explaining flatten than raise. The first important thing here, and I didn't actually know this until sometime midway through last year, when I was practically finished making Checola. Like, I learned this in the middle of that course. And that is probably the biggest distinction between the two, which is not that flatten smooth the terrain and raise doesn't. It's that raise brush's height adjustment is basically infinite, and flatten brush's height adjustment is not. If we take this up here, just any raise brush, and let's just go around and round, hit the same area a few times. This is something you can completely do on controller or mouse or whatever. Just goes up and 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 up. Isn't this gorgeous? That's raised brush for you. I actually think it's a little bit easier here to demonstrate with a harder edged brush. And you'll see this keeps going up. Now why? 1'8", it's just the increment. If we come over to flatten and use the same brush, you'll notice here a very, very different result. First off, it all generally comes up to the level, but I can go over this as many times as I want, and you can see it's not raising more than roughly 1'8". If I raise, it would be through the top of the screen by now, but this is not. Let go, all just comes up a little bit, about 1'8". We want to get a measure mark here just to see. 9.2 feet. I forgot because of the undo function. That was probably a little over 7.5 to 8 to start with. Something like that. Huge distinction. So when you're using raise and flatten brushes, either of them, you can use this to your advantage. So either brush, especially where they kind of tend to bump and stuff, especially with raise, you can kind of take this and just, watch where you're going and adjust the size a little bit perhaps, or you can adjust the height. So let's say the brush will bump, and then you can counteract that right away, and maybe pick it back up where you want. All of these brushes, raise and flatten, they will both bump a little bit. When flatten brush bumps, it works a little bit differently. It doesn't quite get the same level of bumping in the terrain. Actually controlling the flatten brush when it bumps is a lot tougher to do really well, and that is something I would want to save for a later episode. I would also say that for the most part, this is something that's being really precise with the flatten brush is a lot easier on mouse than keyboard. Alright, see you later, Manatee. So for this, I do want to... I could switch over to controller as well. Oh, actually, that's a huge thing too. Yeah. So a lot of times on the controller, when you're using flatten brush in particular, it's a lot harder to control if you're trying to drag click sometimes, and that it's just going to bump and bump, and it's harder to find the exact spot where you want to be to go back over it, especially if you need to start doing some stuff to equalize in between the bumps. So there's that. But there's one other important thing to keep in mind, which is that in general with both sets of brushes, raise brush, both of them generally hit their full height in the center of the click. So this will go, fuzzy brush never goes as much as it says, maybe about 60%. If we click there, let's take a raise brush, up or down, it's the same. The brushes that have like a full-on white center, these will go the full distance with a sitting single click, like if you don't drag at all. If you drag it, they go a lot more. And if you don't drag, it will just go 11 inches. So this kind of brush will go that full height in the middle. If we go up 1'9", it's going to go up roughly 1'8", 1'9". If you use small clicks with raise, you get very small adjustments. That can be handy if you're really trying to fine-tune something. But for flatten, we have a completely different thing. Yeah, you can take this and do the same exact thing, but a lot of flatten's power comes from what happens outside the middle, and even related to what goes on at the center of the brush. So for this in particular, fuzzy brush is quite good for this. The center of the flatten brush is roughly the height, especially with 0'0" or a small increment, is the place at which it will equalize the surrounding heights. It's extremely important to pay attention to where the center of the flatten brush is. For instance, these are both 0'0" clicks. Let's make this pretty big. Centered on this high spot, it brings everything up towards the high spot. If we center on this low spot, it starts to bring everything else around it down towards the low spot. And if you go out roughly in the middle here, kind of get a mix and equalization. So this is one really big thing to keep in mind if you're using flatten brush for this kind of stuff. Always, always, always pay attention to where the center of the brush is when you're using it. It's important for raise too, just in that you know how it's going to react and where. But for flatten, it's the absolute most important thing about using the tool. That is something that not everybody knows, and also it's another thing that I knew that a little longer ago than the height cap. Let's see, what else do we have? So the next thing, and this is another, I guess, quote-unquote mistake that I sometimes see newer designers making, which is you're sculpting and you're like, okay, let's just go add some fairway undulation. We want to raise this part here, whatever. That's all well and good, but I would recommend that for the most part, when you're making terrain adjustments, unless you really know exactly where you're going and what you're doing with the tools, you'll have a better time if you angle the camera a little bit closer to ground level so that you can pretty much see what you're getting with the click before you actually click. And based on what I did here, I would say this might be an adjustment that improves the way this terrain looks. I'm not saying that's necessarily good, bad, or otherwise. That sits pretty nicely. You could not tell if this was going to be good or not from above. Unless you had kind of figured out, okay, I want the brush centered roughly here, and then just go up and make it large. So the next important tools thing, and there's a whole bunch of stuff here. For sculpting, this one's twofold. And let's just blow this up a bit. Let's go raise brush here. Quickly going to make this bunker higher. Okay, so we're going to want to sculpt this bunker. And there are two things to keep in mind, actually. I'm going to undo it as well, or delete it, to show you this. So the next part, let's take out the bunker. And especially when you're using smaller brushes, this is more prone to happening. Ignore the shape here, it will probably have some crinkly edges. That is totally okay for now. If we look at this terrain here, we can see this middle part is quite high. Now it's possible it's just high because of how I sculpted it before when I was messing things up. But this next part goes hand in hand. If you're using raised brush to sculpt the insides of your bunkers, this is not as big a deal. But if you're using flatten brush to sculpt the inside of bunkers, because of an offset it has based on the auto-generated terrain, or because of HB's algorithm, this is even more important. And that is that there's something I like to say where when bunkers, quote-unquote, don't have sufficient sand in them. That may sound really dumb and stupid to some of you guys, but basically what it means is there might be spots in this bunker where it hasn't reached its full auto-generated added depth. Like you saw, I added more sand here to the bunker, and this bit lowered. If you're trying to sculpt that with flatten brush, it will not function as well with the next thing that I'm about to introduce to you guys. So you want to make sure that your bunker has enough sand that it all reaches its predetermined depth. Doesn't seem to be any more happening. We are good. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, I'm actually going to adjust the lighting for this as well. This is going to be an aside tip, which is, I like to adjust my lighting a lot when I work. By no means, there's nothing that says you have to do this or can't do this. How flat for bunkers is too flat? Completely depends on the style you're going for, is all I can say. And we actually get into sculpting some bunkers later on in the tutorial, like different styles, and then getting them to look good, and framing, and some shape stuff, and that kind of thing. There will be a lot more going on with different bunker depths, how flat the sand is, how high the sand wall flashes up, and all sorts of different stuff. But we're not quite there yet. That's going to come in a little bit. This is still much more basic. Because we got to talk about what Victory Lane Sports calls, quote-unquote, bunker math. For the uninitiated here, I'm just going to start. You see this brush? This is on flatten brush, and it says it's going to raise 7 inches. This is not actually going to raise 7 inches. This is going to lower almost a foot because of the way HB's auto-generated bunker depth works. Boom. See how much that lowered? So the trick here is, and it's actually two other things I should explain about the tools first, kind of help you guys understand a little bit of what I just did. The first thing is, the fuzzy brush in particular, I'm not positive, but I believe that how it works is that the center always gets like maybe 60% of the way towards the height it's set at. And if you keep going over something over and over again, it will get infinitely closer to the point where it's essentially the same. Maybe if you go back and forth over something 20 times, it will drop essentially the full depth or raise the full height of what you're setting it at. That's just kind of something with the way the brush works. And that is a point that you guys will want to keep in mind for some advanced techniques with the flatten brush later on. But for here, what it means is, so if I just click once, it won't lower as much as it will if I were to come back up the same 7 and then drag and hit the same spot a couple times. This will lower more because it gets closer to the difference. So what are the numbers for bunker math here? It's a little bit different depending on where in the bunker you are, but generally speaking, the main numbers to keep in mind are around 1'5" to 1'6". If you go up 1'5" to 1'6", you should get roughly a flat result. I should click here and we should see minimal to no height movements. Let's undo that and watch. All it really did was just flatten this out a touch. That's essentially flat here. So if you want to drop your bunker depth just a little bit, you can go maybe, 1 foot or around there. Click here, click there. And this is only with flatten. With raise, bunker math does not apply. It functions naturally. If you want it a little deeper, just drop the number lower. This is one way to do this. And we have, it's very plain, but it's effectively a sculpted bunker. At least the inside of the sand is sculpted. So that is how this works. Was there something else I wanted to say? I think so, but I can't remember where I was. What did you mention? How flat is too flat? Is it that? I'm not sure. Might come back to me, or it might be something for later on. So that's kind of like a basic intro to tools as they relate to general flatten and raise brush mechanics and some bunker sculpting stuff. The next thing is much more just a general pointer, and that is near the beginning, or I'll probably have it in a separate portion here. There's a video that Mayday, or actually I think he just goes by Jeremy Mayo now on YouTube, made called Randomizing a Course Plot. And basically he walks through a method where you essentially make your own auto-generated plot. What I mean by that is, in this first section over here where I just quickly demonstrated how to make a centerline bunker and get some rough around it, you see the fairway basically just flattened what was there. If we just delete this path here, we can see the area in here is actually got a lot of stuff going on with the terrain. Generally speaking, when you lay down the surface on auto-gen terrain, it will mostly flatten it out. And then you can kind of go around the edges here. And remember, if you're using flatten brush, if you keep this brush on the fairway here, it won't bring the fairway down so much, it will bring the stuff off the fairway up. So another important example of paying attention to where the flatten brush is centered. If it's off the fairway, oh whoops, you're bringing the fairway edge down to where you are. Which can work. It all depends on what you're going for. But anyway, he made a video on how, essentially how to make your own like homemade auto-gen plot, where this kind of undulation will maintain itself once you've laid down the fairway surfaces. And with that in particular, so in this instance, let's disregard for this part that surfaces will generally sculpt themselves when you put stuff down. And also one really important thing on that note. If you just use raise brush to make terrain changes, it does not cancel out HB's auto sculpt, auto flatten stuff when you lay down surfaces. It's critical that you use flatten specifically to get that out of the land. But this general idea, I'm trying to think if it's best to demonstrate this by by just working with some land that's already there, or by like changing features in the plot. But I guess either is the same. So we kind of had this golf hole over here that I just quickly, I put this green site in another time, and then just drew like a potential fairway path for it. By no means final or like the highest quality work, it's just quick up. Sculpt brushes work as well. Sculpt brushes, I don't believe, remove that. Sculpt brushes only affect the terrain if it was not affected by blue brushes previously. And how you doing, Rob? The tutorial he has actually walks a little bit through most of that, but I believe the reason he uses the sculpt brush first, like the red brushes, is to get the plot high enough off the water table so that he doesn't have issues with that later on. But anyway, the idea is that generally speaking, you want to be making like big macro adjustments to the land with raise brush. So we can go here, say we kind of want to bring this up over here, like add in some land stuff this way. Maybe we want to make it more dramatic. Something like this. And this is by no means like finished or whatnot, but just kind of as an example. You can drag click this too. We're just, you know, adding some stuff to the plot if you want to do that. And you can use autogen purely as is. There is nothing wrong with that. Say if you want to kind of hollow this part out, then get like a more interesting shape, kind of like mountain peak that's kind of been sheared away at a little bit by wind. Kind of bring this up, go for something like that, maybe. Just different stuff to get all sorts of landforms. And the reason you raise with this. Now let's do the same stuff with flatten. You take out all the terrain detail, you end up with a really smooth product, which can work in spots if that's what you want. But it's just going to take a lot of the contour that's already there out of the land. And it forces you into a position where if you want any kind of natural smaller undulation in the terrain or something like that, you're going to have to make it all yourself. I guess one good example is, I know Maddie from Canada used to use flatten brush for everything. I think he did that on Ogopogo. Let me type that out real quick. Perhaps this course's single biggest weakness is that most of the macro sculpting, or everything, was done with flatten brush, so that any undulation in the land that is there had to be added in manually. Which basically means all this stuff in here, you'd have to, sculpt in stuff like this and go use different brushes to get a look like this, which can be quite tedious. After that, I think for Little Lake Loop and then Yoho River, he did a lot more of that stuff. Although Yoho was a much smoother sculpting style, he did a lot more of that stuff with raised brush. And if you're using raised brush, you're going to preserve all of that, which can then give you the option for later where you can say, oh, I actually quite like the way some of this terrain stuff going on in here fits the golf hole or the style I'm going for, and you can choose to keep a lot of that in the product. You don't have that option if, one, you're using the basic kind of HB method where it will auto flatten after you lay it on the surface, and two, if you do all the macro sculpting, like the big general plot stuff with flatten brush, you won't have that option because all of this stuff here, this will be gone. It'll just be really, really smooth. All depends on what you're going for. There are a couple designers who do quite well sculpting most of it in by hand, although generally those are few and far between, and I think even for the people who do it best, you can still almost tell in spots that they're doing that. It can be the same sometimes with building like a predetermined routing idea, which I think there's a little bit of that on my current work in progress. So anyway, there's one last thing for this portion, and that is that generally speaking, and something I'm still a culprit or culpable of doing at times. Generally speaking, you want to pay more attention to what the land is doing than what number the brush says. Like if you want this land up like kind of here, if you want to raise this stuff up here a good bit, I mean, you're not going to think, whoa, I'm raising it 43 feet. You can just kind of say, okay, this looks good. Click. Especially when you're using fuzzy brush, the numbers are almost always going to be more dramatic than you would expect them to be based on the adjustment you're getting. But even with other brushes, it's very much for the most part about what you see. There are a couple cases where I tend to go a little bit more by the numbers, and that's a little more in my current course if I'm using some of those really harsh edged brushes like this stuff I would use on some of the bunker lips to get a really sharp, aggressive, defined look. For general use, I would not recommend that. And especially with softer brushes, if you want to add in either with flatten or raise some lip definition to your bunkers, I would very much recommend you pay good attention to what you're seeing with the tools more so than the number. The number you see, is this the end result you want? Is the question you really want to be asking yourself. With raise, you can double back over to raise it more. With flatten, it just gets closer to the number. But those are a couple of other things you want to keep in mind in general.